Jack Morrison had 42 years of nothing to show for his life until a ghost white mare appeared in a lightning storm and led him to a cave that held $80 million in rare earth minerals. The horse vanished the moment he stepped inside, leaving him alone with a fortune he had no idea how to claim and enemies who would kill to take it from him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jack Morrison never believed in signs from above, but on that October evening, when the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise and the wind began to howl like something wounded and desperate, he found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about fate and fortune. The storm had come out of nowhere, the way they sometimes did in the Montana high country, transforming a peaceful afternoon ride into a fight for survival in the space of 20 minutes. His gelding had thrown a shoe 3 miles back, forcing Jack to lead the limping animal on foot while the temperature dropped and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. He was 42 years old, a ranch hand with nothing to show for 2 decades of hard work except calloused hands, a bad back, and a bank account that never seemed to grow no matter how many hours he put in. The Carmichael Ranch, where he'd worked for the past 15 years, was cutting staff, and Jack knew his name was near the top of the list. Too old to be fast, too proud to complain, too poor to retire. That was how he'd described himself to the bartender in town last week, and the words had tasted like ash in his mouth. The lightning began as he crested a ridge, jagged bolts that split the darkening sky and illuminated the landscape in brief, terrifying flashes. His gelding, Murphy, whinnied nervously and tried to pull away, but Jack held firm to the reins, speaking in low, calm tones that he didn't feel. They needed shelter, and they needed it fast. The high country was no place to be caught in the open during a lightning storm, and the temperature was dropping so quickly that Jack could see his breath now, white clouds that dissipated almost instantly in the driving wind. He pulled his duster tighter and scanned the horizon, searching for any kind of outcropping or overhang that might provide protection. That was when he saw her. The albino mare appeared from behind a stand of twisted pines, her coat so pure white that she seemed to glow even in the gathering darkness. Jack had worked with horses his entire life, had seen every color and combination imaginable, but he'd never encountered an albino quite like this. She was magnificent, with pink-rimmed eyes that watched him with an intelligence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. She had no saddle, no bridle, no markings of any kind to suggest ownership. For a moment, Jack wondered if he was hallucinating, if the cold and the fear had somehow conjured this impossible creature from his imagination. The mare took 3 steps toward him, then stopped and looked back over her shoulder, as if waiting for him to follow. Murphy nickered softly, his ears pricked forward with interest despite the storm raging around them. Jack knew he should be cautious. Wild horses in these mountains could lead a man into dangerous territory, and following an unknown animal in a storm was the kind of decision that got people killed. But something in the mare's eyes, something in the way she held herself with patient expectation, made him trust her in a way he couldn't explain. He clicked his tongue and started forward, leading Murphy behind him, and the albino mare turned and began to walk at a steady pace into the deepening storm. The rain came in earnest then, sheets of water that soaked through Jack's duster in seconds and turned the ground beneath his boots into treacherous mud. The lightning was constant now, thunder rolling across the mountains like artillery fire, and Jack had to shout at Murphy to keep the gelding from bolting. Through it all, the white mare moved with supernatural calm, her pale form a beacon in the chaos that Jack followed with growing desperation. They climbed higher into the rocky terrain, leaving the tree line behind and entering a landscape of stone and shadow. Jack's lungs burned from the thin air and the exertion, his legs trembling with exhaustion as he struggled to keep pace with the mare. Just when he thought he couldn't go another step, when his vision was starting to blur and his hands were so cold he could barely feel Murphy's reins, the albino stopped. She stood before a wall of rock that rose up into the storm-dark sky, and for a terrible moment Jack thought she had led him to a dead end, that his trust had been misplaced and he would die here in the mountains with only a phantom horse for company. Then the lightning flashed again, and in that brilliant white light he saw it. The cave entrance was narrow, barely visible behind a tumble of boulders that seemed deliberately arranged to hide it from casual observers. The mare walked forward without hesitation, disappearing into the darkness, and Jack followed because there was nowhere else to go. The moment he stepped inside, the howl of the wind cut off, as if someone had closed a door. The sudden silence was so profound that Jack's ears rang with it. He could hear water dripping somewhere deeper in the cave, the sound of Murphy's labored breathing, and his own heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to escape. Before we go deeper into Jack's discovery, tell us where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's chapter is going to change everything you think you know about hidden fortunes. Jack fumbled in his saddlebag for the flashlight he always carried, his frozen fingers clumsy but determined. When the beam finally clicked on, illuminating the cave's interior, his breath caught in his throat. The walls weren't just rock, they were covered in something that glittered and gleamed in the flashlight's beam, veins of mineral deposits that ran through the stone like frozen lightning. And standing in the center of that impossible space, watching him with those knowing pink eyes, was the Albino Mare, waiting to show him something that would change his life forever. Jack's hands shook as he moved the flashlight beam slowly across the cave walls, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The mineral veins weren't just decorative, they were substantial, running deep into the rock face in patterns that suggested an extensive deposit. His father had worked in the copper mines of Butte before the accident that killed him, and Jack had spent enough time around miners as a boy to recognize when rock held something valuable. This wasn't copper, though. The way it caught the light, the greenish-blue color with streaks of gold running through it, suggested something far more precious. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched the wall, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the mineral deposit. It was real, solid, not a hallucination brought on by cold and fear. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to calculate what he might be looking at. If this was what he thought it was, if this cave held even a fraction of the wealth suggested by these visible veins, then his life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. Murphy had moved deeper into the cave, seeking shelter from the storm that continued to rage outside. The Albino Mare stood perfectly still, watching Jack with an expression that seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for him to understand something important. He pulled his gaze away from the walls and really looked at the cave for the first time. It was larger than he'd initially thought, extending back into the mountain with several chambers visible in the flashlight's beam. The floor was relatively flat and dry, covered in a fine dust that showed no footprints except the fresh ones he and the horses had just made. Nobody had been here. Not recently, possibly not ever. The entrance had been so well hidden that Jack would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing, and the terrain was remote enough that most people never ventured this far into the high country. He'd only come this way because Murphy had thrown the shoe, forcing him off his usual route back to the ranch. The storm outside intensified, thunder shaking the mountain and rain hammering against the rocks with a fury that made Jack grateful for the shelter. He unsaddled Murphy and rubbed the gelding down with his saddle blanket, then checked the mare to see if she was injured or needed care. She stood calmly under his inspection, allowing him to run his hands over her legs and body, checking for cuts or swelling. She was in perfect condition, well-fed and healthy, with hooves that had been recently trimmed. Someone owned this horse or had owned her, but there were no ranches within 20 miles of this location, no brands or markings to indicate where she'd come from. It was as if she'd materialized from thin air specifically to lead him to this cave. Jack had never been a superstitious man, but standing in that hidden chamber with a phantom white mare and walls full of what might be a fortune in precious minerals, he found himself reconsidering his position on divine intervention. He pulled out his phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen showed nothing. No bars, no connectivity, just the useless glow of technology, rendered impotent by geography. Not that he knew who he would have called anyway. The ranch foreman would just tell him to get back to work. The sheriff's office would probably laugh at his story about being led to a cave by a mysterious horse. His ex-wife would assume he was drunk and hang up. The truth was, Jack Morrison had spent the last 20 years becoming invisible, the kind of man people looked through rather than at. And now he'd stumbled onto something that could make him very visible indeed. The thought terrified him almost as much as it excited him. He'd grown comfortable with invisibility, with the low expectations and minimal responsibilities that came with being just another aging ranch hand. Wealth would change everything, would demand things from him that he wasn't sure he could provide. Intelligence he'd never demonstrated, courage he'd never shown, the kind of determination that had always seemed to belong to other men. But then he thought about his daughter, Sarah, who he hadn't seen in 3 years because his ex-wife had moved to Seattle and he couldn't afford the plane tickets. He thought about the way his back seized up every morning, the grinding poverty that meant choosing between buying groceries or getting his truck repaired. He thought about Hank Carmichael's face last week when he'd handed out the layoff notices, the apologetic but firm way he'd told Jack that times were changing and the ranch couldn't support as many hands as it used to. At 42, Jack was too young to retire but too old to start over, caught in that terrible middle ground where opportunities dried up and options narrowed to nothing. This cave, these mineral deposits, they represented something he'd given up hoping for years ago. A second chance, a way out, a future that held more than slow decline into irrelevance and poverty. The albino mare moved closer, her breath warm against his cold hands. Jack looked into those strange pink eyes and saw his own reflection staring back. Wet, bedraggled, frightened, but alive. Still here, still capable of making choices that mattered. He'd followed her into the storm against all reason and logic, and she'd brought him to this place. Now he had to decide what to do with it. Outside, the thunder rumbled like a promise or a warning, and Jack realized that whatever choice he made in this moment would define the rest of his life. He could walk away, pretend he'd never seen this place, return to his quiet slide into obscurity, or he could reach out and grab this impossible gift with both hands, consequences and complications be damned. The mare nickered softly, and somehow Jack knew she was telling him to be brave. Jack spent the night in that cave, huddled in his duster with his back against the mineral-rich wall, watching the storm rage beyond the narrow entrance. Sleep came in brief, fitful bursts, interrupted by thunder and the constant awareness that his entire world had shifted on its axis. The albino mare stood near the entrance like a sentinel, her white coat luminous in the darkness, while Murphy dozed fitfully nearby. Every time Jack opened his eyes, she was there, watching, waiting, as if guarding something precious. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the mountains scrubbed clean and glistening with rainwater. Jack's body ached from the cold and the hard stone floor, but his mind was racing with possibilities and problems in equal measure. He needed to stake a claim on this land, needed to figure out who owned it and whether it was even available. More importantly, he needed to keep this discovery quiet until he could secure his rights to whatever wealth lay hidden in these walls. The moment word got out, this cave would be swarmed with prospectors, mining companies, and lawyers, all trying to claim a piece of what he'd found. He pulled a small notebook from his saddlebag, the kind he used to record fence repairs and cattle counts, and began sketching a rough map of the cave's location. The landmarks were distinctive enough: the twisted pines, the specific ridge formation, the boulder field that concealed the entrance. But Jack deliberately left out certain details, made the map incomplete in ways that would prevent anyone else from finding this place without his guidance. It was a precaution that felt both paranoid and essential. He'd heard too many stories about prospectors who'd made strikes only to lose them to claim jumpers and corrupt officials, men who knew how to work the system and had the resources to push aside someone like Jack Morrison. He took several photographs with his phone, documenting the mineral veins from different angles, making sure to capture the depth and extent of the deposits. The images would serve as proof when he needed to convince someone, a geologist perhaps, or an investor, that this was worth pursuing. But who could he trust? That question haunted him as he packed his gear and prepared to leave. The ranch was expecting him back today, and his absence would be noted if he didn't show up. Hank Carmichael ran a tight operation, and unexplained absences were grounds for termination even before the layoffs started. Jack couldn't afford to lose his job, not yet, not until he'd secured his claim and had some sense of what this discovery might be worth. He'd have to play it careful, maintain his normal routine while quietly working to stake his claim and assess the value of what he'd found. The thought of returning to his cramped bunkhouse room and pretending nothing had changed felt surreal, like trying to put on clothes that no longer fit. But survival in the West had always required patience and planning, the ability to keep your cards close and your intentions hidden until the moment was right. His father had taught him that back before the mine collapse that had crushed more than just his body. "Don't let them see you coming," his father used to say. "Make your move when they're looking the other way." Jack turned to say something to the Albino Mare, to thank her somehow for leading him here, but she was gone. He spun around, searching the cave and the area immediately outside, but there was no sign of her. No hoofprints in the mud beyond his own and Murphy's, no white coat visible among the rocks and trees. It was as if she'd vanished the same way she'd appeared, a ghost or a vision that had served its purpose and moved on. The rational part of Jack's mind insisted there had to be an explanation. She'd wandered off while he was packing, taken a path he hadn't noticed, but the part of him that had followed her into the storm knew better. Whatever that mare had been, wherever she'd come from, she'd brought him to this cave for a reason. Now it was up to him to make something of it. Murphy was ready to travel, the rest seeming to have restored his energy despite the thrown shoe. Jack fashioned a temporary boot from leather scraps and duct tape, enough to get them back to the ranch without causing further injury. As he led the gelding away from the cave, he took one last look at the hidden entrance, committing every detail to memory. This place would change his life. He was certain of it, but only if he was smart enough and strong enough to claim what it offered. The ride back to the Carmichael Ranch took most of the day, following deer trails and old logging roads that kept him away from the main paths where he might encounter other riders. His mind worked constantly, planning and calculating, trying to anticipate every obstacle and opportunity. He'd need to visit the county assessor's office, determine the ownership status of the land where the cave was located. If it was federal land, the claim process would be different than if it was private property. He'd need to research mineral rights laws, figure out what he was legally entitled to versus what he'd have to negotiate for. And he'd need money for filing fees, for geological surveys, for legal representation if things got complicated. Jack had $840 in his checking account, $3,000 more in a savings account he'd been building for the past decade. It wasn't nearly enough, not for what he needed to do, which meant he'd have to find investors or partners, people willing to put up capital in exchange for a share of whatever the cave contained. The ranch came into view as the sun was setting, the familiar buildings and corrals looking strange and foreign after what Jack had experienced. He stabled Murphy and checked in with the foreman, explaining the thrown shoe and the storm as reasons for his delay. Hank Carmichael nodded, making a note in his log, and told Jack to report to the north pasture in the morning for fence work. It was routine, mundane, exactly the kind of conversation they'd had 1,000 times before. But Jack felt different now. like he was playing a part in a play, going through motions that no longer defined him. He walked to his bunkhouse room and lay down on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the Albino Mare, the hidden cave, and the fortune that might be waiting there if he was brave enough and clever enough to claim it. Tomorrow he would start making his moves carefully and quietly, building towards something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The county assessor's office in Red Lodge was a tired-looking building that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee, staffed by a woman named Martha Hendricks, who'd held the position for 23 years and looked like she'd been tired for at least 20 of them. Jack had driven the 40 miles into town on his day off, telling the other ranch hands he had business to attend to, which was true enough even if he kept the specifics vague. Martha looked up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who'd seen every type of land dispute and claim imaginable, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she studied Jack with weary assessment. He'd changed out of his ranch clothes into the one decent pair of jeans he owned and a clean button-down shirt, trying to look professional and serious rather than desperate. The effect was probably lost on Martha, who dealt with desperate men every day and had developed immunity to their particular brand of hopeful desperation. Jack spread his hand-drawn map on the counter, keeping his finger over the specific details that would give away the exact location. He explained that he was interested in researching the ownership status of a parcel of land in the high country, approximately 15,000 acres in the Medicine Bow Range. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly at the acreage, and she pulled up her database with fingers that moved across the keyboard with surprising speed. The screen flickered through pages of information, while Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on what she found. If the land was privately owned, he'd need to negotiate with the owner, which would require revealing what he'd discovered and hoping they'd be willing to deal fairly. If it was federal land, the claim process would be complicated but at least transparent. There was also the possibility that someone already held mineral rights to the area, which would make his discovery worthless to him regardless of its actual value. Martha's expression shifted from bored efficiency to something more interested as she read whatever the screen was telling her. She looked up at Jack, then back at the screen, then up again with new assessment in her eyes. According to the records, the land Jack was asking about was private property that had been in the same family for 3 generations. The current owner was a woman named Elizabeth Blackwood, age 78, who lived in Billings and hadn't visited the property in over a decade. The taxes were paid through an automated system, and there was a notation that the land had been listed for sale twice in the past 15 years, but had never found a buyer due to the remote location and lack of road access. Martha printed out the information and handed it across the counter, her expression neutral but her eyes curious. She asked Jack if he was interested in purchasing the property, and he'd mumbled something non-committal about exploring options and thanking her for her help. As he left the office, he felt her watching him through the window, and he knew she'd remember this visit. Small-town bureaucrats had long memories and an instinct for when something unusual was happening. He'd have to be more careful going forward, more strategic about who he contacted and what information he revealed. The drive back to the ranch gave Jack time to think. Elizabeth Blackwood was 78 years old, which meant she might be willing to sell if the offer was right. But Jack had less than $4,000 to his name, nowhere near enough to purchase 15,000 acres, even at rock-bottom prices. He'd need to approach her differently, perhaps propose a partnership or a lease agreement that would give him access to the land and mineral rights in exchange for a percentage of whatever he found. It was risky because it meant revealing his discovery before he'd secured his claim, but he couldn't see another path forward. Unless he could find an investor, someone willing to put up the capital to purchase the land outright with Jack maintaining operational control and a significant share of the profits. But who? He knew ranch owners and ranch hands, men who worked with their backs in their hands, not the kind of people who had money to invest in speculative mining ventures. The wealthy families in the region were old money, conservative and suspicious of outsiders, especially aging cowboys with wild stories about hidden caves and mysterious white horses. That evening in the bunkhouse, Jack found himself confiding in Ray Hutchins, a 60-year-old hand who'd worked ranches across Montana and Wyoming for 40 years, and had the kind of weathered wisdom that came from hard experience. They sat on the porch steps sharing a bottle of whiskey that Ray produced from somewhere, watching the sun set over the mountains while the other hands played cards inside. Jack told him everything: the storm, the mare, the cave, the mineral deposits that might be worth nothing or might be worth millions. He showed Ray the photographs on his phone, the sketches in his notebook, the information from the assessor's office about Elizabeth Blackwood. Ray listened without interrupting, his lined face thoughtful as he considered what Jack was telling him. When Jack finally fell silent, exhausted from the telling and the fear that he'd just made a terrible mistake by trusting someone, Ray took a long pull from the whiskey bottle and stared out at the darkening landscape. Ray told him about his brother-in-law, a man named Thomas Chen who'd made a fortune in rare earth minerals 20 years ago and now lived semi-retired in Bozeman, investing in mining ventures and geological surveys. Thomas was always looking for the next big strike, the kind of man who understood risk and reward in ways that most people never would. Ray said he could make an introduction, but he warned Jack that Thomas would want his due diligence done properly. He'd want geological surveys, core samples, professional assessments of what the cave actually contained and what it might be worth. And he'd want a significant piece of whatever came from it in exchange for putting up the capital. Ray looked at Jack with eyes that had seen too many men fail and too few succeed, and asked if he was ready for what would come next. Because once Jack started down this road, once he brought in investors and staked official claims and made his discovery public, there would be no going back to the quiet, invisible life he'd been living. He'd be making himself a target for every claim jumper, con artist, and corporate shark who smelled money in the water. Jack thought about his daughter Sarah, about the way she'd looked at him with disappointment during their last phone call, when he'd had to tell her he couldn't afford to come visit for her birthday. He thought about the grinding poverty that had defined his adult life, the constant struggle to keep his head above water while younger men with better luck and better connections moved past him. He thought about the Albino Mare and the way she'd led him through the storm to that hidden cave, as if fate or fortune or something beyond his understanding had decided to give him one last chance to become someone different than the man he'd resigned himself to being. He looked at Ray and said yes, he was ready for whatever came next. Ray nodded slowly, pulled out his phone, and started dialing his brother-in-law. The conversation that followed would set in motion events that Jack couldn't possibly anticipate, a cascade of choices and consequences that would test everything he thought he knew about himself and what he was capable of becoming. Thomas Chen arrived at the ranch 3 days later in a black SUV that looked absurdly out of place among the pickup trucks and ranch vehicles. He was a compact man in his early 60s, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that had clearly never seen actual outdoor work, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Jack made in 6 months. But his handshake was firm and his eyes were sharp with intelligence, the kind of man who'd built his fortune by recognizing opportunities that others missed and moving fast when he spotted them. Ray made the introductions in the ranch parking lot, and Thomas suggested they drive out to see this cave that Jack had been so mysterious about on the phone. Jack hesitated, aware that once he showed Thomas the location, he'd be surrendering his only real leverage in any negotiation. But Thomas seemed to read his concern and pulled out a single-page document from his briefcase. It was a non-disclosure agreement, simple and straightforward, promising that any information shared during their meeting would remain confidential regardless of whether they moved forward with a business arrangement. Jack signed it with hands that only trembled slightly, then climbed into Thomas's SUV for the drive into the high country. The conversation during the drive was casual but probing. Thomas asked about Jack's background, his experience with geology and mining, how he'd come to find the cave. Jack told the story carefully, leaving out only the most inexplicable parts about the albino mare's behavior. Even edited, it sounded far-fetched, a tale of unlikely coincidence and remarkable luck that would make anyone suspicious. But Thomas listened with the patience of someone who'd heard stranger stories and knew that fortunes were often built on exactly this kind of improbable discovery. He asked technical questions about the mineral deposits, their color and texture, the extent of the visible veins. Jack answered as best he could, aware that his lack of expertise was showing, but trying to convey the magnitude of what he'd seen. When they reached the trailhead where Jack had left Murphy during the storm, Thomas insisted they continue on foot. The man might dress like a city investor, but he moved through the rough terrain with surprising ease, his expensive hiking boots finding purchase on stones and his breathing steady despite the altitude. It took them 90 minutes to reach the cave, following Jack's sketched map and his memory of that desperate night. The entrance looked even more concealed in daylight, the tumbled boulders and twisted pines creating a natural camouflage that would have fooled anyone who wasn't specifically looking. Thomas studied the approach with professional interest, noting how the geography made the location both valuable and problematic. Valuable because it was so hidden that Jack's claim to first discovery would be virtually uncontestable. Problematic because extracting minerals from such a remote location would be expensive and logistically challenging. They squeezed through the narrow entrance and Thomas pulled out a high-powered LED headlamp that made Jack's flashlight look like a child's toy. The beam illuminated the cave's interior in brilliant detail, and Jack heard Thomas suck in his breath sharply. The mineral deposits that Jack had seen by flashlight were even more impressive in the LED's intense light. The veins ran deep and extensive, branching through the rock in patterns that suggested this wasn't just a surface deposit but something substantial, potentially massive. Thomas moved along the walls with careful precision, examining the minerals from different angles, taking photographs and making notes in a leather-bound journal. He produced a small toolkit and used a hammer and chisel to extract several samples, bagging them individually and labeling each with detailed location information. The process took over 2 hours, and Jack watched with growing anxiety as Thomas worked in focused silence. Finally, the investor sat back on his heels and looked at Jack with an expression that was hard to read. He said he couldn't be certain without laboratory analysis, but based on his experience and the visual characteristics of the deposits, Jack had found a significant rare earth mineral formation, possibly containing elements like cerium, lanthanum, and neodymium. These materials were crucial for modern electronics, electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, and military applications, and the United States was heavily dependent on foreign sources for its supply. A domestic source, especially one of this apparent quality and quantity, would be worth substantial money to the right buyers. Thomas estimated, very roughly and pending confirmation, that the cave might contain deposits worth anywhere from $50 million to several $100 million, depending on the exact composition and the ease of extraction. The numbers hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd known the cave might be valuable, but hearing actual figures, even rough estimates, made the reality almost impossible to process. $50 million, $100 million, $200. The amounts were so far beyond his experience that they felt like fiction, like numbers from a news story about other people's lives. Thomas packed away his samples and equipment, his movements efficient and businesslike. He explained that the next steps would be expensive and time-consuming. They'd need to conduct proper geological surveys, drill core samples, analyze the mineral composition, and calculate extraction costs. They'd need to secure the land, either through purchase or mineral rights leases, before anyone else discovered what Jack had found. And they'd need to move quickly, because secrets this big never stayed secret for long, especially in small communities where people noticed when outsiders started asking questions and conducting surveys. Thomas proposed a partnership structure where he would provide the capital for all surveys, land acquisition, and initial development costs in exchange for 40% ownership of whatever they extracted. Jack would retain 51%, maintaining majority control, with the remaining 9% going to Ray Hutchins for making the introduction and providing local knowledge and support. The terms were more generous than Jack had expected, and Thomas explained that he'd learned long ago that the best partnerships were ones where everyone felt fairly treated. Resentment and suspicion could destroy a venture faster than any external threat, and Thomas wanted Jack invested in the success of this operation, not fighting him over percentages. Jack thought about the offer as they hiked back toward the SUV. 49% of $50 million was still more money than he could comprehend, more than enough to transform his life and his daughter's life in ways he'd never dared imagine. But Thomas was asking him to trust that the estimates were accurate, that the geological surveys would confirm what they suspected, that the extraction costs wouldn't eat up all the profits. There were 1,000 ways this could go wrong, 1,000 opportunities for Jack to end up with nothing despite having found something extraordinary. Yet the alternative was trying to develop the claim on his own, which was impossible without capital and expertise he didn't possess. Sometimes the only choice was between calculated risk and certain failure, and Jack had spent too many years choosing safety over possibility. He stopped on the trail and turned to Thomas, the mountains stretching endlessly around them, and said he accepted the partnership terms. Thomas smiled, the first real emotion Jack had seen from him since they'd met, and pulled out his phone to start making calls. By the time they reached the SUV, Thomas had already scheduled geological teams, contacted lawyers about land acquisition, and begun the process of turning Jack Morrison's improbable discovery into a legitimate mining operation. The machinery of wealth and development was grinding into motion, and Jack felt himself being pulled along in its wake, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The geological team arrived 2 weeks later, 3 specialists from a Denver firm that Thomas had worked with before, professionals who knew how to conduct surveys discreetly without drawing attention. They set up camp 5 miles from the cave, accessing the site through a series of old logging roads that kept them away from the main trails where curious locals might spot them. Jack continued working at the Carmichael Ranch during the day, maintaining his normal routine, while his mind churned with thoughts of core samples and mineral assays. The waiting was excruciating, made worse by the knowledge that every person who learned about the cave increased the risk of the secret getting out. Ray Hutchins watched him with knowing eyes during their shifts, occasionally asking quiet questions about how things were progressing, but mostly just providing silent support. The other ranch hands noticed Jack's distraction, but attributed it to the stress of impending layoffs, which was true enough, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Elizabeth Blackwood proved harder to reach than Jack had anticipated. Her phone number went to voicemail repeatedly, and the address in Billings turned out to be a retirement community, where the staff politely but firmly refused to pass along messages without her explicit permission. Thomas suggested they hire a lawyer to make formal contact, presenting an offer to purchase the land through official channels. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance, who specialized in mineral rights and land acquisitions, drafted a letter offering $300,000 for the 15,000 acres, a price well above market value for remote mountain property, but nowhere near what the land might actually be worth if their suspicions about the mineral deposits proved correct. The offer was structured to close quickly, with minimal contingencies, designed to appeal to an elderly landowner who might appreciate the simplicity of a straightforward cash transaction. Patricia warned them that if Elizabeth was shrewd or had advisors, she might smell opportunity in such a generous offer and start asking questions. But Thomas felt the risk was worth it because every day they delayed was another day someone else might stumble onto the cave or notice the survey activity. The first complication arrived in the form of Marcus Webb, a claim jumper and con artist who'd been working the Montana mining scene for 20 years. Ray spotted him in Red Lodge asking questions about recent survey activity in the Medicine Bow Range, showing interest that went beyond casual curiosity. Marcus had a reputation for identifying promising claims and finding ways to insert himself into the profits, sometimes through legal maneuvering and sometimes through methods that skirted or crossed ethical boundaries. His presence meant that rumors were already spreading, that the careful discretion Jack and Thomas had tried to maintain was breaking down. Ray suggested they accelerate their timeline, push Elizabeth Blackwood for a decision, and get the land secured before Marcus or someone like him could complicate the situation. Thomas agreed, instructing Patricia to contact Elizabeth directly by phone and press for an immediate response to their offer. The lawyer managed to reach her on the fourth attempt, and the conversation that followed was both promising and concerning. Elizabeth was interested in selling, tired of paying taxes on land she never visited and never would. But she wanted to know why someone would pay $300,000 for property that previous buyers had considered worthless, and she wasn't satisfied with vague explanations about investment portfolios and land speculation. Patricia handled the conversation with professional skill, explaining that her clients were interested in the property for private recreational use and believed the asking price reflected its value as a remote retreat. Elizabeth seemed partially convinced, but requested time to consult with her financial advisor before making a decision. She promised an answer within 1 week, which gave Jack 7 days of agonizing uncertainty during which anything could happen. The geological team's preliminary results arrived during that waiting period, and they were even better than Thomas had hoped. The core samples confirmed substantial deposits of rare earth elements, particularly neodymium and dysprosium, both critical for manufacturing powerful permanent magnets used in electric vehicles and wind turbines. The concentration was high, the deposit extensive, and the extraction appeared feasible despite the remote location. The team estimated that the cave was actually the surface expression of a much larger underground formation that extended deep into the mountain. Full exploitation would require significant infrastructure investment, but the potential return was enormous. Thomas showed Jack the technical reports with barely contained excitement, explaining that they were looking at a domestic rare earth source that could supply a significant percentage of American demand for decades. The strategic value alone would attract government interest and support, potentially streamlining permitting and environmental reviews. Jack read the reports in his bunkhouse room late at night, struggling to understand the technical language, but grasping enough to know that his life was changing in ways he still couldn't fully comprehend. The numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates put the total value at $80 million. Optimistic projections reached $250 million, even accounting for extraction costs, infrastructure development, and various fees and taxes. Jack's 51% share would make him wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined. He thought about calling Sarah, telling her that he'd found something that would change everything, but he held back. The deal wasn't closed yet, and there were too many ways it could still fall apart. Better to wait until everything was secured, until the land was purchased and the claims were filed, and the whole operation was moving forward with unstoppable momentum. Until then, he was still Jack Morrison, aging ranch hand, working fence line repairs, and trying not to think too hard about the fortune that might or might not materialize. Marcus Webb made his move on the 5th day of waiting for Elizabeth's decision. He showed up at the ranch asking for Jack by name, a stocky man in his 50s with calculating eyes and a smile that suggested he knew more than he was saying. They talked in the parking lot, Marcus leaning against his truck with casual confidence while Jack tried to keep his expression neutral. Marcus said he'd heard interesting rumors about survey activity in the high country, about a ranch hand who'd suddenly gotten friendly with investors from Bozeman, about geological teams asking questions in Red Lodge. He didn't know exactly what Jack had found, but he knew it was something significant and he wanted to offer his services. Marcus had connections with mining companies and government officials. Experience navigating the complex regulatory environment that governed mineral extraction on Western lands. He could be useful, he suggested, or he could be a problem. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Jack felt anger rising in his chest alongside fear. This was exactly what Ray had warned him about, the moment when jackals appeared to claim pieces of something they hadn't worked for or risked anything to find. Jack told Marcus he didn't know what he was talking about, that the geological team was conducting routine environmental surveys for the ranch and had nothing to do with mining. The lie was transparent, and Marcus's smile widened as if Jack had just confirmed everything he'd suspected. He handed Jack a business card, suggesting they talk again when Jack was ready to be more honest, and drove away, leaving Jack standing in the parking lot with his heart pounding and his mind racing through implications and complications. Ray found him there 20 minutes later, still holding Marcus's card and staring at the mountains that held both his fortune and his future. Ray asked what Marcus had wanted, and Jack told him everything. Ray's expression darkened, and he said they needed to tell Thomas immediately. Men like Marcus Webb didn't make casual visits or empty threats. He'd keep digging, keep asking questions, and eventually he'd find someone willing to talk, or some record that would lead him to the cave. Their window for keeping this quiet was closing fast, and they needed Elizabeth Blackwood's answer before that window slammed shut completely. Elizabeth Blackwood's answer came on the 6th day, delivered through Patricia Vance in a phone call that Jack took while standing in the ranch equipment shed, his hands covered in grease from repairing a tractor engine. Patricia's voice was carefully controlled, the tone lawyers used when delivering news that could go either way. Elizabeth had accepted their offer with one significant modification. She wanted $400,000 instead of $300,000, and she wanted to meet Jack Morrison in person before signing anything. The increase in price was manageable. Thomas had authorized Patricia to go as high as $500,000 if necessary, but the demand for a face-to-face meeting complicated everything. Elizabeth had made it clear through her financial advisor that she suspected something unusual was happening, that the generous offer and the rushed timeline suggested her land was worth more than they were saying. She wasn't willing to sign away her property without understanding why someone suddenly wanted it so badly. Patricia explained that they had 3 options. They could refuse the meeting and risk Elizabeth withdrawing from the deal entirely. They could send Patricia as their representative, maintaining distance between Jack and the seller. Or Jack could meet with her directly and try to convince an intelligent, suspicious 78-year-old woman that their interest in her land was exactly as innocuous as they claimed. Thomas flew to Montana the next day to discuss strategy, meeting Jack and Ray at a diner 30 miles from the ranch, where they were unlikely to be recognized. Thomas looked tired, the stress of the situation showing in the lines around his eyes and the way he drank his coffee like it was medicine. He explained that Elizabeth Blackwood wasn't just some elderly woman they could easily mislead. His research had revealed that she'd been a professor of geology at Montana State University before her retirement, specializing in mineralogy and ore deposits. She'd published papers, consulted for mining companies, and had forgotten more about rocks and minerals than most people would ever know. If they tried to lie to her about why they wanted her land, she'd see through it immediately. If they told her the truth about the rare earth deposits, she'd either demand a much higher price or refuse to sell at all, choosing instead to develop the claim herself or sell to a major mining corporation. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion and frustration, and asked Jack what he thought they should do. It was Jack's discovery, Jack's claim to first rights, and ultimately Jack's decision about how to proceed. The question hung in the air between them while the diner's other patrons ate their meals and talked about weather and cattle prices, oblivious to the conversation happening in the corner booth. Jack thought about the Albino Mare, the way she'd led him through the storm with such purpose and certainty. He thought about the cave and the fortune it represented, about Sarah and the life he could give her if this all worked out. But mostly he thought about the kind of man he'd been for the past 20 years, taking the easy path, the safe choice, the option that required the least courage and demanded the least from him. That man would have told Thomas to walk away, to find another investor or another claim, anything rather than risk confrontation with someone as formidable as Elizabeth Blackwood clearly was. But that man had died in the storm, replaced by someone who'd followed a phantom horse into the unknown and found something worth fighting for. Jack told Thomas he'd meet with Elizabeth and he'd tell her the truth, or at least enough of it to satisfy her concerns while still protecting their interests. He'd explain about finding the cave, about the preliminary surveys, about the rare earth deposits that could make them all wealthy if they could just secure the land and develop it properly. He'd appeal to her as a geologist who understood the significance of domestic mineral resources, as a Montanan who knew the value of keeping development local rather than letting it fall to outside corporations, and if she still refused to sell or demanded more than they could afford to pay, then they'd deal with that problem when it arose. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at Elizabeth's retirement community in Billings. Jack borrowed a suit from Ray's nephew, a banker in Missoula who was approximately Jack's size, and spent an hour in front of a mirror practicing what he wanted to say. Thomas offered to come along for support, but Jack refused. This needed to be personal, one person talking honestly to another about something that mattered to both of them. He drove to Billings alone, his truck feeling inadequate among the luxury cars in the retirement community parking lot, his borrowed suit feeling like a costume. Elizabeth met him in a common room decorated with comfortable furniture and windows that looked out over manicured gardens. She was smaller than he'd expected, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair cut short and eyes that were still sharp with intelligence despite her age. She gestured for him to sit and ordered tea from a staff member with the casual authority of someone accustomed to respect. They made small talk for exactly 3 minutes, the kind of polite conversation that established baseline civility without revealing anything important. Then Elizabeth set down her teacup and asked Jack to tell her why he really wanted her land. Jack took a breath and began talking. He told her about the storm and Murphy's thrown shoe, about seeking shelter in terrain he didn't know well. He described finding the cave, the mineral deposits he'd seen, the photographs he'd taken in the LED headlamp's light. He explained about Thomas Chen and the geological surveys, about the rare earth elements that might be worth tens of millions of dollars if they could just secure the property and develop it properly. He didn't mention the Albino Mare because that part of the story sounded too much like fantasy, but he told her everything else, watching her face for reactions that would tell him whether he'd made a terrible mistake. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but her eyes missing nothing. When Jack finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming softly on the arm of her chair in a rhythm that suggested she was thinking through calculations and implications. Finally, she asked to see the photographs, and Jack pulled out his phone with hands that only trembled slightly. She examined each image carefully, zooming in on details and making small noises of interest or approval. Her questions were technical and precise, the kind only someone with deep geological knowledge would think to ask. She wanted to know about the matrix rock, the depth of the veins, the color variations that might indicate different elemental compositions. Jack answered as best he could, aware that his lack of expertise was obvious, but hoping his honesty would compensate for his ignorance. Elizabeth seemed to appreciate his frankness, the way he admitted when he didn't know something rather than trying to fake knowledge he didn't possess. She asked about the geological team's findings, and Jack offered to have Thomas send her the technical reports if she wanted to review them. She said that wouldn't be necessary, that she believed him about what he'd found. The question now was what to do about it. She explained that she'd bought that land 40 years ago with her late husband, planning to retire there and study the geological formations in their old age. But her husband had died 15 years ago, and Elizabeth had never found the heart to visit the property alone. She'd let it sit unused, paying the taxes out of habit and inertia, unable to sell but unable to use. Now Jack had found something on her land that she'd never discovered in all her years of study, and she wasn't sure whether to feel grateful for the opportunity or resentful that someone else had succeeded where she'd failed. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, her small frame silhouetted against the afternoon light as she looked out over the gardens that represented the quiet, safe life she'd chosen after her husband's death. Jack waited, hardly breathing, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would determine whether his fortune materialized or evaporated like morning fog. When she finally turned back to him, her expression had softened into something that might have been nostalgia or regret. She told Jack about her husband Robert, who'd been a wildcatter and prospector before settling down to teach at the university. Robert had loved that land in the Medicine Bow Range, had spent countless weekends hiking through those mountains looking for something extraordinary. He'd never found it, but he'd never stopped believing that something remarkable was hidden up there, waiting for the right person to discover it. Elizabeth said that Robert would have loved this moment, would have appreciated the poetry of a cowboy fleeing a storm and stumbling onto exactly what Robert had spent years searching for. She asked Jack what his plans were if they completed the sale, whether he intended to sell the deposit to a major corporation or try to develop it independently. Jack explained the partnership with Thomas Chen, the plan to maintain local control while bringing in expertise and capital as needed. He emphasized that they wanted to keep the development in Montana, to hire local workers and support the regional economy, rather than letting outside corporations extract the wealth and take it elsewhere. It was partially strategy, telling Elizabeth what he thought she wanted to hear. But it was also true. Jack had lived in this state his entire life, had seen too many booms and busts driven by outside interests that cared nothing for the communities they affected. If he was going to become wealthy from this discovery, he wanted to do it in a way that benefited the people and places that had shaped him, that gave something back to the land that had given him this extraordinary opportunity. Elizabeth listened with an expression that was hard to read, then returned to her chair and picked up her teacup. She told Jack she would sell him the land for $400,000 as she'd proposed, but with conditions. She wanted 5% of net profits from any minerals extracted to be paid annually for as long as the mine operated. She wanted environmental protections built into any development plan, real protections with teeth and enforcement mechanisms, not the kind of vague promises that companies made and then ignored. And she wanted her name attached to the discovery in some meaningful way, perhaps as part of the mine's official designation or in academic papers that would document the find. It was her last chance to contribute something to the field she'd devoted her career to, and she wasn't willing to let it pass without recognition. The terms were more complicated than Jack had hoped, but less onerous than he'd feared. 5% of net profits would be substantial if the mine proved as valuable as the survey suggested, but it wouldn't cripple the operation or reduce Jack's share to insignificance. The environmental protections were actually welcome, providing cover against accusations of exploitation and demonstrating good faith to regulatory authorities who would scrutinize any rare earth development proposal. And the naming rights cost nothing, while giving Elizabeth something that clearly mattered to her. Jack agreed without hesitation, and Elizabeth smiled for the first time since they'd met, a genuine expression that transformed her lined face and revealed the brilliant woman she'd been before age and loss had worn her down. She called Patricia Vance immediately, instructing her lawyer to draft an addendum to the purchase agreement incorporating the new terms. The conversation was brisk and professional, Elizabeth rattling off legal requirements and specifications with the precision of someone who'd reviewed countless contracts during her academic career. When she hung up, she turned back to Jack and offered her hand. He shook it gently, aware of her age but feeling strength in her grip that belied her fragile appearance. She told him to take care of her land, to treat it with respect and intelligence, and to make sure whatever they extracted was used for something that mattered. Jack promised he would, and he meant it. The drive back to the ranch felt surreal, as if Jack were floating above his truck and watching someone else navigate the familiar roads. He'd done it. He'd secured the land, negotiated terms that all parties could accept, and set in motion the machinery that would transform him from struggling ranch hand to mining magnate. The thought was so absurd that he laughed out loud, the sound echoing in his truck's cab and startling him with its genuine joy. He called Thomas from the road, explaining the new terms and Elizabeth's conditions. Thomas was quiet for a moment, calculating, then said it was a good deal, better than they had any right to expect given Elizabeth's expertise and the leverage she could have wielded. The 5% profit sharing was fair, and the other conditions were manageable if they planned carefully and committed to doing things right rather than fast and cheap. Thomas said he'd have his lawyers coordinate with Patricia to finalize the paperwork, that they could probably close within 2 weeks if Elizabeth was willing to move quickly. Jack asked about Marcus Webb, whether there had been any new developments or threats. Thomas said Marcus had been quiet, which was more concerning than reassuring, because men like that were most dangerous when you couldn't see what they were doing. Jack reached the ranch as the sun was setting, the mountains painted in shades of orange and gold that reminded him of that first night in the cave when everything had changed. He parked his truck and sat for a moment, trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. In 2 weeks, he'd owned 15,000 acres of Montana mountain property. In 3 months, if the development timeline held, they'd begin extraction operations. In 6 months to a year, he'd start seeing returns on his 51% share of what might be the most significant rare earth discovery in American history. The numbers still felt unreal, but the land was real, the minerals were real, and the future unfolding before him was more real than anything he'd experienced in decades. He thought about Sarah and decided he'd call her tonight, tell her he had good news coming but couldn't share details yet. She'd be skeptical. She'd learned not to trust his promises after too many disappointments. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he could actually deliver on something important. Ray found him in the bunkhouse later that evening, packing the few belongings he'd accumulated during his years at the ranch. Jack was leaving, giving his notice to Hank Carmichael in the morning, moving into town where he could focus on the mine development full-time. Ray asked if he was sure about leaving before the deal was completely closed, before the money was actually in hand. Jack said he was sure that staying at the ranch while preparing to become a mining executive felt dishonest, like he was lying to Hank and the other hands about who he was and what he was doing. Ray nodded understanding, then asked the question that had been hanging between them since this whole thing started. "What about the mare, Jack? What about that albino horse that led you to the cave? You ever see her again?" Jack admitted he hadn't, that he'd looked for her several times when visiting the cave with Thomas and the geological team but found no trace. No hoof prints, no sightings, no evidence that she'd ever existed outside that one stormy night. Ray said sometimes gifts came in forms you couldn't explain or understand, that the important thing was recognizing them and having the courage to accept what they offered. Jack thought about that as he finished packing, wondering if the mare had been real or hallucination, divine intervention or remarkable coincidence. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd followed her into the storm, that he'd trusted something beyond logic and reason, and that trust had led him to exactly where he needed to be. The closing took place in Patricia Vance's office on a Tuesday morning in late November, with early snow already dusting the streets of Billings and winter settling into the high country like a declaration of intent. Jack sat at the conference table in clothes he'd bought specifically for the occasion, actual dress pants and a button-down shirt that fit properly, feeling like an imposter among the lawyers and professionals who handled transactions like this every day. Elizabeth was there, looking small but formidable in a burgundy suit that probably cost more than Jack used to make in a month. Thomas Chen sat beside Jack, his briefcase open and documents arranged with precise organization, while Patricia walked them through the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The process took 90 minutes, each party signing multiple copies of agreements and addendums, initialing changes and acknowledging conditions. When it was done, Patricia shook everyone's hands and said the deed transfer would be recorded by end of business, making Jack Morrison the official owner of 15,000 acres of Montana mountain property and everything those acres contained. Thomas took them to lunch at an expensive steakhouse where Jack felt conspicuous and out of place among businessmen and professionals celebrating deals and promotions. But the food was excellent, and Elizabeth told stories about her years teaching at the university, about students who'd gone on to discover deposits in Nevada and Arizona, about the peculiar satisfaction of understanding Earth's secrets when most people never looked past the surface. She asked Jack what he planned to do with his wealth once the mine was producing, and he realized he hadn't thought much beyond securing the claim and surviving the development process. "Sarah," he said finally. He'd make sure his daughter never had to worry about money for education or opportunity, that she could pursue whatever life she wanted without the limitations that had defined his own choices. Elizabeth nodded approval, saying the best use of unexpected fortune was creating possibility for the next generation. They finished lunch with handshakes and promises to stay in touch, and Jack drove back toward Red Lodge feeling like he'd just stepped through a doorway into a completely different life. The trouble with Marcus Webb came 3 days later, arriving in the form of a legal filing that Thomas's lawyers discovered during routine monitoring of county records. Marcus had filed a mining claim on property adjacent to Elizabeth's land, a narrow strip that his surveyor alleged overlapped with the cave's location by approximately 200 feet. The claim argued that Jack's discovery actually fell within Marcus's boundaries, making any mineral extraction subject to Marcus's approval and entitling him to significant compensation. It was clearly a shakedown, a legal maneuver designed to force Jack into settling rather than fighting an expensive boundary dispute. Thomas was furious when he called to explain the situation, his usual calm professionalism replaced by barely controlled anger. Marcus had been watching them, tracking their movements and filings, waiting until the land purchase was complete before making his move. Now they faced the choice of paying Marcus off or spending months in legal battles that would delay development and eat into their capital. Jack asked how much Marcus wanted, and Thomas said the demand hadn't been specified yet, but would likely be substantial, possibly millions depending on how greedy Marcus felt and how weak he thought their position was. Jack drove out to the cave that afternoon, needing to see the place that had caused all this complication. The approach was more difficult in snow, his truck struggling on roads that were barely passable, but he made it to the trailhead and hiked the rest of the way on foot. The cave entrance looked exactly as it had that first night, hidden and mysterious, holding secrets that were now becoming public knowledge whether Jack wanted them to or not. He stood in the cold silence, watching his breath make clouds in the freezing air, and thought about Marcus Webb and the casual cruelty of people who took rather than earned, who saw vulnerability and exploited it without conscience or shame. Jack had spent his life avoiding confrontation, choosing peace over justice, accepting less than he deserved because fighting back required energy and courage he'd convinced himself he didn't possess. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who'd claimed something valuable and wasn't going to let parasites like Marcus steal it through legal intimidation. He called Thomas from the cave entrance, his decision made. They weren't paying Marcus anything. They'd fight the boundary claim, hire the best surveyors and lawyers money could buy, and prove that Marcus's filing was fraudulent. If it took months and cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, so be it. Jack had something worth fighting for, and he was finally ready to fight. The legal battle consumed the next 3 months, a grinding war of depositions and expert testimonies that tested everyone's patience and resources. Marcus's surveyors presented evidence that seemed credible on surface examination, old maps and measurements that suggested the boundary lines were ambiguous. But Thomas's team brought in specialists who demonstrated that Marcus's survey was based on deliberately misread benchmarks and coordinates that had been manipulated to create the appearance of overlap. The county surveyor was called to testify, and her analysis supported Jack's position, showing that the cave fell well within Elizabeth's original property boundaries, with no legitimate dispute about ownership. Marcus fought every point, filing motions and appeals that delayed proceedings and ran up costs, clearly hoping Jack would exhaust his resources or his will before the case concluded. But Jack had something Marcus didn't expect: the support of a community that had watched Marcus operate for years and was tired of his predatory tactics. Ranchers and business owners who'd been victimized by Marcus's schemes came forward with testimony about his pattern of fraudulent claims and legal harassment. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over mining disputes for 2 decades, grew visibly annoyed with Marcus's tactics and began ruling against him with increasing frequency. The final hearing took place on a March morning, when spring was just beginning to soften winter's grip on the high country. Marcus's lawyer made one last argument about ambiguous boundaries and reasonable doubt, but the judge cut him off mid-sentence. She'd reviewed all the evidence, consulted with independent experts, and concluded that Marcus Webb's claim was not only without merit, but appeared to be deliberately fraudulent. She ruled in Jack's favor on every point, assessed court costs and legal fees against Marcus, and warned him that future frivolous filings in her jurisdiction would result in sanctions and possible criminal charges. Marcus sat in the courtroom with his face flushed red, hands clenched on the table before him, watching his attempted extortion collapse into public humiliation. When the hearing ended, he stormed out without speaking to anyone, and Jack felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was there. The weight of fighting, of refusing to be victimized, of standing up for what was his had been enormous, but he'd carried it, and now it was done. The cave was his, the minerals were his, and the fortune they represented would be built on foundation of legitimate claim and hard-won justice. Thomas met him outside the courthouse, grinning with satisfaction that went beyond simple legal victory. The permits had been approved, the environmental reviews completed, and the infrastructure development was ready to begin. They had investors lined up, contracts with manufacturers who desperately needed domestic rare earth supplies, and a timeline that would see first extraction within 6 months. Everything Jack had worked and fought for was finally coming together, the improbable discovery in that storm-dark cave transforming into reality, with weight and substance. They drove back to Red Lodge together, talking about next steps and operational details, but Jack's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the Albino Mare, about whether she'd somehow known what she was doing when she led him through that storm, whether there was purpose and intelligence behind her appearance, or whether he was just a lucky man trying to impose meaning on coincidence. Ray had been right that some gifts couldn't be explained, only accepted. Jack had accepted what the storm and the mare had offered, and now he had to prove himself worthy of it. The first extraction took place on a September morning, exactly 1 year after the storm that had changed Jack Morrison's life. He stood at the cave entrance watching crews maneuver equipment through the widened access road they'd carved into the mountainside, heavy machinery that would carefully extract the rare earth minerals while minimizing environmental damage per the promises he'd made to Elizabeth Blackwood. The operation employed 43 people, mostly local workers who'd been trained in specialized extraction techniques, men and women who treated Jack with a respect he still wasn't entirely comfortable receiving. He was no longer the invisible ranch hand working fence lines for minimum wage. He was Jack Morrison, owner and operator of the Blackwood Morrison mine, a man whose opinions carried weight and whose decisions affected dozens of families and millions of dollars in contracts and commitments. The transformation still felt surreal some mornings when he woke in his house outside Red Lodge, a modest place by wealthy standards but palatial compared to his bunkhouse room, and remembered who he'd been just 12 months ago. Sarah had visited 3 times in the past 6 months, their relationship slowly rebuilding after years of distance and disappointment. She was 23 now, working on a master's degree in environmental science that Jack was funding without the strain and sacrifice that had defined his own limited education. They'd gone hiking together during her last visit, and she'd asked him about the cave, about what it felt like to go from poverty to wealth so quickly. Jack had struggled to articulate the strangeness of it, how money solved certain problems while creating others, how respect felt different when you weren't sure if people valued you or your bank account. Sarah had listened with the patience she'd inherited from her mother, then said something that stuck with him. She said the real measure of his transformation wasn't the money or the mine, but whether he'd become someone different or just someone with more resources to be the same man he'd always been. Jack thought about that question often, examining his choices and behaviors for signs of corruption or arrogance, trying to remain the person who'd followed an albino mare into a storm because he trusted something beyond himself. Elizabeth Blackwood had visited the mine in July, touring the operation with professional interest and obvious satisfaction. The environmental protections they'd implemented exceeded regulatory requirements, and Jack had named the primary extraction chamber the Blackwood Formation in honor of her late husband's decades of searching. Elizabeth had cried when she saw the plaque, tears running down her weathered cheeks while she touched the engraved letters that memorialized Robert's passion and persistence. She told Jack he'd done something rare in modern mining, built an operation that extracted wealth while respecting the land and the people it affected. The 5% profit sharing she received would fund scholarships at Montana State University for geology students, ensuring that future generations would have opportunities that might not otherwise exist. Jack felt proud of that, proud that his fortune was creating ripples beyond himself, touching lives and communities in ways that justified the extraordinary luck that had brought him to this point. Thomas Chen had calculated that Jack's share of first-year profits would exceed $12 million, with projections suggesting the mine would produce for at least 20 years, possibly longer if exploration revealed additional deposits in the surrounding formations. The numbers still seemed impossible, but Jack's bank account confirmed their reality. He'd paid off every debt he'd accumulated during his lean years, bought his ex-wife a house in Seattle as partial compensation for the child support he'd been unable to provide consistently, and established trust funds for Sarah and any future grandchildren. He donated to the Carmichael Ranch's Employee Emergency Fund and quietly covered medical bills for 3 ranch hands who'd been injured on the job over the years. He'd bought Ray Hutchins a new truck and ensured his friend's 9% share was managed properly, set up to provide income for the rest of Ray's life. These acts of generosity felt good but also inadequate, as if no amount of money could truly compensate for the years of struggle and disappointment that had defined so many lives in this harsh, beautiful country. Jack understood now that wealth was responsibility as much as freedom, that having resources meant making choices about how to use them in ways that mattered beyond personal comfort or satisfaction. He was still learning how to be wealthy, still making mistakes and questioning decisions, but he was trying to do it with integrity and awareness of how fortunate he'd been. The afternoon sun was dropping toward the mountains when Jack decided to walk up to the ridge where he'd first seen the Albino Mare. The crews had finished for the day, and the mine site was quiet except for security personnel and the hum of equipment running diagnostic cycles. He climbed the familiar trail, his legs stronger now from regular exercise and better nutrition, his breathing steady despite the altitude. The ridge offered views across miles of wilderness, The same landscape that had seemed so threatening during the storm but now appeared peaceful and eternal. Jack stood watching the light change, thinking about the year that had passed and all the years ahead, grateful and humbled by turns. Then he heard it behind him, the soft whinny of a horse approaching through the pines. He turned slowly, half expecting to see nothing, but she was there. The albino mare stood 20 feet away, her white coat glowing in the golden light, those strange pink-rimmed eyes watching him with the same intelligence and purpose he remembered from that desperate night. Jack's heart hammered as he approached her carefully, speaking softly the way he'd learned as a boy around horses. She didn't retreat or show nervousness, just stood calmly while he came close enough to touch her neck. Her coat was warm and real under his palm, proof that whatever she was, she existed in this moment with solid presence. He asked her questions that had no answers, thanked her for gifts he couldn't fully comprehend, tried to express gratitude that went beyond words. She nuzzled his shoulder gently, her breath warm against his neck, and Jack felt tears running down his face. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming emotion that combined relief and joy and wonder in equal measure. He'd spent so many years feeling invisible and worthless, convinced his life would end as it had begun, with nothing to show for decades of work except weariness and regret. The mare had led him to something different, something extraordinary, and he'd had the courage to follow her into the unknown, despite every logical reason to retreat. That choice, that moment of trust during a storm when fear and desperation could have paralyzed him, had changed everything. The mare stayed with him for perhaps 10 minutes, then turned and walked back into the trees with the same unhurried grace she'd shown that first night. Jack didn't try to follow. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, only accepted and appreciated for what they offered. He stood on the ridge until the sun touched the horizon, then walked back down to his truck and drove home through gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, questions about expansion and markets and operational efficiency that he was still learning to navigate. But tonight he just wanted to sit on his porch and watch the stars emerge, grateful for storms and white horses and hidden caves, for the extraordinary ways that ordinary lives could transform when you were brave enough to trust the improbable and follow where it led. The albino mare was out there somewhere in the mountains, watching or wandering, real or mythical or something beyond category. Jack Morrison, former ranch hand, current millionaire, had been given something precious by forces he would never fully understand. Now it was his responsibility to prove worthy of that gift by living with courage and integrity and gratitude for as long as he drew breath.